January 29, 1944, Berlin, Germany. The night is not dark, the sky is alive, pulsing with a malevolent orange glow. The deep, discordant choir of air raid sirens has given way to a more terrifying symphony. The rising drone of 1,000 Allied bomber engines, the percussive crump of exploding flak, and the distant, earth-shaking thunder of high explosives meeting city streets. Searchlight beams slash through the smoke and cloud, frantically probing the blackness. Among them, tracer fire from countless anti-aircraft batteries stitches fiery seams across. The heavens below the city trembles. And yet in the heart of this maelstrom, three massive, windowless monoliths stand. Utterly unmoved, the Flaktürme at the Berlin Zoo is a silhouette against the inferno. From its roof, the 128 twin cannon of its Gefechtsturm, the combat tower, speak with a different voice, not a rapid crackle, but a methodical, deafening boom, boom. Boom, each muzzle flash is a brief, blinding sun, illuminating the structure's brutal concrete face. Inside, shielded by walls over 3.5 meters thick, the crews work in a world of artificial light and controlled chaos. The floor vibrates with each recoil. They are not hiding, they are fighting back from what was believed to be the most impregnable defensive position ever conceived. On this night the doctrine holds, the bombs fall around it, the tower stands, but high above, in the freezing, oxygen-thin air, a new type of warfare is being conceived, a weapon designed not to avoid this fortress, but to pierce its very heart. The reign of the unconquerable Flaktürme has begun its final countdown. The Third Reich began the Second World War with an unshakable confidence in the offensive power of the Luftwaffe. The doctrine was blitzkrieg, lightning war, where tactical dive bombers like the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka acted as flying artillery, shattering enemy lines ahead of the panzer divisions. Defense, particularly of the homeland, was an afterthought. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring famously boasted, "No enemy bomber can reach the Ruhr. If one reaches the Ruhr, my name is not Göring. You can call me Mayer." This arrogance evaporated on the moonlit night of May 15–16, 1940. In response to the German bombing of Rotterdam, the Royal Air Force dispatched 99 bombers to strike industrial targets in the Ruhr Valley. While the material damage was negligible, the psychological impact was seismic. The war had come home to Germany. The RAF's strategic bombing campaign, though initially small and inaccurate, was a harbinger of a new, terrifying reality: the vulnerability of German cities to aerial assault. As the war dragged on and turned against Germany after the failure to subdue the Soviet Union and the entry of the United States, the Allied bomber offensive swelled into a round-the-clock hammer. The RAF by night, the USAAF by day, German Flak Flugabwehrkanone or anti-aircraft cannon, defenses, though extensive and lethal, were largely ground-based, spread out, and vulnerable to counterbombing. Losses among gun crews were high. More critically, the civilian population was being battered there. Morale, a key Nazi concern, was fracturing under the relentless tonnage of high explosives and incendiaries. It was against this backdrop of escalating terror from the skies that Adolf Hitler, a man obsessed with monumental architecture, personally intervened. In the aftermath of the first major British thousand-bomber raid on Cologne in May 1942, he convened a meeting with his personal architect and Minister of Armaments, Albert Speer. The problem was clear: German anti-aircraft defenses needed to be concentrated, protected, and made into unassailable bastions that would also serve as shelters for the Volk. The solution, however, would be drawn not from a military field manual, but from Hitler's own vision of Germania, the future world capital. He demanded fortress-like structures, cathedrals of air defense. They were to be both functional weapon platforms and potent symbols of Nazi invincibility. The task of translating this dictatorial vision into reality fell to a team led by Professor Friedrich Tams, a bridge and road engineer under Speer's supervision. The design was not born from incremental military improvement, but from a single, brutal imperative: Create something that could not be destroyed by any existing bomb. The result was the Flaktürme of Flak Tower complex. This was not a simple gun emplacement. It was a self-contained defensive ecosystem, a paired structure of breathtaking scale and reinforced concrete. The first generation, Bard-I, rose with terrifying speed in Berlin, Hamburg, and Vienna starting in 1940. These were not just military installations. They were the physical manifestation of a regime digging in, preparing to wage a defensive war of attrition from colossal, urban citadels. They represented a fundamental shift from the mobile, offensive warfare of the early blitzkrieg to a static, defiant posture rooted in the very heart of the cities the Reich was pledged to protect. The concrete was poured, the guns were mounted, and a legend of impregnability began to solidify. Even as the war fronts collapsed inward, these towers stood as silent, daunting challenges to the Allied bomber streams that now darkened the German sky. With increasing regularity, they created zones of terrifying lethality over the Reich's most important cities, forcing pilots to reconsider their routes, their altitudes, and their very chances of survival. Yet, for all their formidable power, the towers' existence posed an even greater question for the Allies. How does one defeat a fortress that floats in a sea of a city, a fortress designed to render all conventional attack obsolete? The answer would not come from evading these concrete giants, but from a weapon designed to meet them head-on from the vertical axis they believed they commanded. The Flaktürme was not a single tower. It was a system, a deadly symbiotic pair known as the Gefechtsturm combat tower and the Leitm fire control tower, separated by several hundred meters to complicate targeting, but connected by a web of buried cables. Each complex was a city block in footprint, a mountainside in mass, and a fortress in function. The Gefechtsturm was the brute, the primary weapon. First-generation towers like the one at the Berlin Zoo measured roughly 70 meters by 70 meters at the base, soaring to a height of 39 meters. Their walls, sloped slightly to deflect blasts, were a nightmarish thickness of 3.5 meters of steel-reinforced concrete. The roof slab was equally formidable at 5 meters thick. This was not a guess at durability, it was calculated overkill. German engineers, aware of the RAF's heaviest bombs in 1940-41, designed the towers to withstand direct hits from anything up to a 1,000-kilogram high explosive bomb. It was a specification that seemed absurdly safe at the time. Inside this gargantuan shell was a multi-story arsenal, the main fighting platform on the roof, typically mounted for twin 128 Mfla K-40 guns, the most powerful anti-aircraft weapon in the German inventory, with a ceiling of over 14,000 meters and a lethal radius of hundreds of meters. Lower terraces bristled with batteries of smaller, rapid-fire 37 and 20 cannons to shred any low-flying aircraft daring to make a strafing run. Beneath the guns, the tower hollowed out into a self-sufficient universe. It contained ammunition magazines, power generation plants, barracks for up to 350 soldiers and crew, surgical hospitals, command centers, and vast storage areas. It had its own water wells and air filtration systems against gas attacks. It was designed to sustain its garrison for weeks under complete siege, crucially, and per Hitler's direct order. Each Gefechtsturm also contained reinforced concrete bunkers capable of sheltering up to 15,000 civilians. This dual purpose was a masterstroke of Nazi propaganda. The tower was both the sword that defended the people and the shield that protected them. Its partner, the Leitm, was the brain, slightly smaller but equally fortified. Its roof was dominated by a massive, rotating Wurzburg giant Wurzburg radar dish, sophisticated apparatus for its time that could accurately track incoming bombers at ranges over 60 kilometers. Below, in darkened rooms lit by the green glow of radar scopes and plotting tables, specialist crews integrated data from radar, optical rangefinders, and spotters. They calculated precise firing solutions, altitude, speed, direction for the batteries on the Gefechtsturm. This data was transmitted instantly via the buried cables, allowing the 128 guns to fire with a terrifying degree of coordinated accuracy, putting up a box barrage of flak through which bombers had to fly. Later generation towers, like the Bort III complexes in Vienna, refined this design, further integrating the fire control radar directly onto the Gefechtsturm itself for an even more streamlined and resilient loop of detection and destruction. By 1943, these concrete constellations dominated the skylines of Berlin, Hamburg, and Vienna. They were psychological landmarks as much as military ones. For German citizens, they were ambiguous symbols, immense shelters promising safety, yet also huge targets that might draw bombs. For the Luftwaffe crews, they were islands of relative security in a crumbling Reich. For Allied airmen, briefed with stark aerial photographs and harrowing crew reports, they were flak parks to be avoided at all costs. They created dead zones in the bomber stream's planned routes, forcing costly diversions and disrupting formations. The towers, in their silent, looming presence, had achieved a form of strategic deterrence through sheer, terrifying durability. They had turned portions of Germany's cities into the most heavily defended square kilometers on Earth, but the very scale of their defense invited a proportionate response, one that was already taking shape in the drawing rooms and testing ranges of a nation whose industrial ingenuity was matched only by its determination to end the war from the air. The challenge of the Flak Tower had been issued, and across the Atlantic the answer was being forged from a simple, brutal principle: if you cannot destroy the walls, you must find a way to pierce the roof. Within the 3.5-meter thick walls, a peculiar microcosm of the late-war German experience played out. For the flak crews, life followed a rhythm dictated by the air raid sirens. During lulls, the tower was a monotonous, echoing world of concrete. Soldiers maintained the massive guns, hauled shells from the deep magazines on electric elevators, and tried to rest in the Spartan barracks, the air permanently tinged with the smells of oil, cordite, and damp concrete. When the sirens wailed, this stillness erupted into a controlled frenzy. Crews, many of them young Luftwaffe auxiliaries or older men, drafted into the Volkssturm, raced to their positions. The command posts deep inside became nerve centers of calm intensity as radar operators called out target bearings, and elevation officers shouted corrections. On the roof, exposed only to the sky, the gun teams worked in a realm of deafening noise and violent physics. The blast from their own 128 guns could kill a man standing too close to the muzzle. They operated in a storm of their own creation, their world reduced to the panoramic view of a burning city. The shudder of the recoil through the reinforced deck and the glowing trajectories of their own shells arcing into the black, searchlight-streaked sky. They were both besieged, and besiegers firing from a sanctuary that made them uniquely lethal. The true power of the Flak Tower was not merely its concrete, but its system. It represented the pinnacle of integrated, ground-based air defense in World War II. At its core was the seamless link between the LATAM sensors and the Gefechtsturm's guns. The Wurzburgreis radar provided critical early warning and rough tracking. This data was fed to a Kommandodret, a sophisticated mechanical computer analog that used input from optical rangefinders and the radar to calculate a firing solution, accounting for the target's speed, course, altitude, wind, and even the temperature of the gunpowder. The resulting azimuth and elevation settings were automatically transmitted to the gun mounts where crews fine-tuned the final aim. This system allowed for Vorhersagen predictive firing, where the guns aimed not at the bomber, but at this point in space where the bomber and the shell would meet seconds later. The four twin 128 mounts could then fire in a coordinated box barrage, filling a precise cubic volume of air with a pattern of exploding shrapnel that a bomber formation had to fly through. It was a terrifyingly efficient factory for manufacturing high-altitude lethality, all orchestrated from within an impervious shell. Beyond their military function, the Flak Towers were ideological statements poured Concrete, they were the direct offspring of Hitler and Speer's vision for Germania, part of a planned architecture of overwhelming scale meant to inspire awe and subjugation. For 1,000 years, their design, while utilitarian, carried a deliberate, intimidating aesthetic: the sheer, unadorned planes of concrete, the stark geometric forms, the staggering verticality. They echoed the megalomaniacal neoclassicism of Nazi Party structures. They were intended to be permanent fixtures, future war memorials, and even ruin value, ruin-inward structures designed to look aesthetically impressive as crumbling ruins millennia hence. In the present, they served a potent propaganda role, tangible proof of the regime's might and its commitment to protecting the Volk. Newsreels showed civilians entering their safe depths, while the guns above roared in defiance. They were physical anchors for morale in a disintegrating reality: concrete proclamations that the heart of the Reich could not and would not be breached. In this, they were perhaps the most honest architecture of the Nazi state: brutal, imposing, defensive, and ultimately entombing. For Allied bomber crews, the Flak Towers transformed from brief curiosities into visceral nightmares. Briefing officers would point them out on mosaic maps: this is Flak Tower, Berlin Zoo. Expect concentrated, heavy, and accurate fire from this sector. Avoid at all costs. In practice, avoidance was a deadly calculus. The tower's guns had a lethal radius that forced bombers into wide, fuel-consuming detours, breaking up the protective integrity of the combat box formation. A formation straying too close would be met by a sudden, terrifyingly precise eruption of black puff bursts, the box spare. Directly in its flight path, the 128 shells exploded with a force that could shred aluminum and flesh in an instant. The psychological toll was immense. Crews knew these positions were virtually invulnerable to their payloads, standard high-explosive bombs. Even the 1,000-pound and 2,000-pound cookies of the RAF would only scar the roof and walls. Attempting a low-level attack to increase accuracy was suicide, funneling the aircraft directly into the meat grinder of the tower's light flak batteries. The towers thus achieved a defensive victory without scoring a direct hit. They distorted attack routes, concentrated bomber streams into other flak corridors, and lived rent-free in the minds of every pilot and bombardier approaching Berlin, Hamburg, or Vienna. They were fixed points of absolute danger in a fluid battlefield, a problem that seemed to have no solution from the air. For the thousands of Berliners, Hamburgers, and Viennese who sought refuge in the Flak Towers, the experience was one of profound contradiction. Admission was a privilege, often granted by a cryptic system of passes, proximity, or sheer chance. Once inside, they entered a dystopian sanctuary. The vast, vaulted bunker halls were overcrowded, stuffy, and permeated with a low hum of fear and diesel generators. Families huddled on hard bunks or the cold concrete floor, their world reduced to the tremors of the guns far above. Each detonation, they felt, was a double-edged signal, a threat to their city, but also the proof of their protectors' power. The Nazi Party used this dynamic masterfully. Propaganda celebrated the towers as air raid protection castles, evidence of the Führer's direct care for his people. This engineered gratitude, however, was fragile. The very act of sheltering within a primary military target created annoying anxiety. Could the structure truly take a direct hit? What if the entrances were blocked by rubble? The tower was both a shield and a potential tomb, a symbol of safety that was also the epicenter of the storm. It encapsulated the civilians' plight in total war, utterly dependent for survival on the very machinery that made them a target. The Flak Tower's immense strength was also the source of its critical vulnerabilities. Its static nature made it a perfect intelligence target. Its coordinates were fixed, its gun arcs plotted, its radar frequencies monitored. This allowed Allied planners to chart exact flak avoidance routes, negating some of its area denial power. Furthermore, the technological brain of the system was its most sensitive point. While the concrete could Withstand bombs, the delicate radar arrays, exposed cabling, and ventilation shafts on the roof were susceptible to fragmentation damage from near misses, a single well placed bomb or strafing run could blind the LATAM, significantly degrading the accuracy of the entire complex. The towers also created a dangerous concentration of resources by centralizing so much firepower and so many civilians in one spot. They presented a target of immense strategic value if only a weapon could be found to engage it. Finally, their very design philosophy was backward-looking, based on the bomb technology of 1940-41. They were fortresses in an age of rapidly evolving aerial siegecraft. The Allies were already working on weapons that defied their foundational premise, bombs that did not just explode on a target, but were designed to penetrate deep into a target before detonating. The towers were a solution to yesterday's problem, and the relentless innovation of the Allied war industry was already crafting tomorrow's answer. Their impenetrability was a conditional statement, waiting for the right set of conditions to be violently disproven. The stage was now set for a clash of material science and sheer will, where the outcome would hinge on a weapon capable of translating the entire destructive potential of a heavy bomber into a single, focused point of impact on an indestructible roof. The solution to the Flak Tower dilemma did not emerge from a desire for vengeance, but from a cold, technical requirement. Since 1941, the United States Army Air Forces had identified a critical gap in their arsenal: the lack of a bomb capable of destroying heavily fortified, hardened targets like U-boat pens, concrete-reinforced command bunkers, and massive industrial structures. Conventional general-purpose bombs detonated on impact, their blast energy dissipating across a hardened surface. What was needed was a bomb that could pierce armor or reinforced concrete, carry its explosive payload deep inside the target, and then detonate, unleashing catastrophic internal overpressure and structural collapse. The answer was the creation of a new category, the displacement or earthquake bomb in British parlance, and the penetrator or semi-armor piercing SAP bomb in the American, while the RAF developed the massive streamlined tallboy, 12,000 pounds, and Grand Slam, 22,000 pounds, bombs designed by Barnes-Wallis for deep penetration. The USAAF pursued a different, more scalable path. Their weapon was the MK-1 4,000-pound bomb, commonly known as the 4,000-pounder or cookie cutter. But the true evolutionary leap was the AN-M59 2,000-pound and AN-M66 1,000-pound hard case bombs. These were not simply larger explosives, they were feats of engineering. Their design was brutally elegant. They featured a thick, high-quality steel casing, much thicker and stronger than a standard general-purpose bomb of the same weight. The nose was solid, often with a specially hardened steel cap, and the body was aerodynamically streamlined to maximize velocity in a free fall. The internal explosive fill, usually a mix of TNT and cyclonite, was cast around a central, recessed well that housed the fusing system. This well design protected the sensitive fuse from the tremendous shock of impact. The fuses themselves were the final, critical piece of the puzzle. Delayed action fuses, like the M124 or M125, which could be set to detonate the bomb milliseconds or even seconds after impact. The physics were simple and devastating. Dropped from high altitude, 20,000 feet or more by a B-17 or B-24, the bomb would accelerate to a terminal velocity approaching the speed of sound. Its hardened nose and immense kinetic energy would act like a pile driver. Upon striking the 5-meter thick concrete roof of a flak tower, it would not bounce or fragment on the surface. It would punch through, shearing through rebar and concrete, traveling deep into the structure's interior. Only then, inside a magazine, generator room, or a barracks level, would the delayed fuse trigger the main charge. The effect was not a surface explosion, but a contained internal cataclysm. The blast wave, with nowhere to go, would reflect off the interior walls and ceilings, creating overpressures that liquefied organs and turned corridors into shock furnaces. It would collapse internal floors, rupture load-bearing walls, and could, in theory, compromise the very structural integrity of the monolithic shell. This was the weapon born to answer the Flak Towers challenge. It turned the tower's greatest asset, its immense, confined interior space, into its ultimate vulnerability. By late 1944, these bombs were entering the inventory of the USAAF strategic bomber forces in Europe. The stage was now set for a direct, brutal test of theory against reality. The question was no longer if the Allies would strike the towers, but when, and with what final, terrible result. The roof is breached, Berlin and Vienna, 1945. The final, convulsive months of the war in Europe provided the grim laboratory. As the Allied armies closed in from east and west, the strategic bombing campaign reached a ferocious, almost tactical intensity. Flak Towers were no longer merely area denial weapons, they were key strongpoints in the defense of doomed cities, pouring fire not just at high-flying bombers, but at low-flying fighter bombers, and even advancing Soviet ground troops. Their destruction shifted from a psychological objective to a military necessity. The first major test came in Berlin during the relentless series of raids in early 1945. The USAAF's 8th Air Force, now equipped with significant stocks of 1,000-pound and 2,000-pound hard-case penetrators, began to explicitly target the Flak Towers. The mission profile was agonizingly dangerous. B-17s had to fly straight and level through the very box spare they had spent years avoiding, their bombardiers aiming for a precise spot on a massive, but still relatively small, rooftop from over 5 miles up. Near misses were meaningless, only a direct hit would suffice. On February 3, 1945, during a massive daylight raid involving over 1,000 B-17s, targeting Berlin's railway infrastructure, several groups were assigned to suppress the flak defenses. The Gefechtsturm at the Berlin Zoo, the iconic first-generation tower, received its first serious attention from the new bombs. While it did not suffer a catastrophic penetration that day, the character of the battle changed forever. The thick roof was cratered and scarred in ways never seen before. Chunks of concrete the size of trucks were blasted away. The psychological impact on the garrison was immediate and profound. The sense of absolute security was shattered. They were no longer in an impregnable fortress, but in the bullseye of a newly capable enemy. The true, undeniable breach, however, occurred in Vienna, the city's 3 later generation bought III Flak Tower complexes at Stiftskaserne, Ehrenberg Park, and Augarten were among the most advanced. Their sleek, circular designs and integrated fire control made them even more formidable. In March and April 1945, as the Soviet Red Army fought street by street towards the city center, the USAAF and RAF launched concentrated raids to break these final bastions of Nazi resistance. It was during one of these late war raids that the theoretical power of the penetrator bomb became horrifyingly real. A 2,000-pound AN-M59 hard-case bomb dropped from a high-flying B-17 of the 15th Air Force found its mark on one of the Vienna towers. Eyewitness accounts from both civilian survivors and Soviet infantry report the same sequence. The bomb struck the roof with a sound unlike any other impact. Deep, metallic crunch thud that reverberated through the surrounding city blocks. It did not explode on the surface. It disappeared. A heartbeat of silence followed. Then from within the bowels of the tower came a deep, muffled whump. The ground trembled. Smoke and dust, lit from within by a secondary orange glow, billowed from gun embrasures, observation slits, and ventilation shafts. The explosion had been contained, channeled, and magnified by the tower's own interior architecture. While the outer walls remained standing, the internal structure was gutted. Fires raged uncontrollably in the confined spaces. Ammunition stores cooked off in sympathetic detonations, causing further internal havoc. The garrison and many of the civilians sheltering inside were killed not by collapsing walls, but by the very overpressure effects the bombs were designed to create. The tower did not topple, it was not razed, but its fighting capacity was annihilated in an instant. The guns fell silent, the radar dishes stopped rotating, it became a smoking concrete tomb. Its myth of invulnerability vaporized along with its crew. The same fate befell, to varying degrees, the other Vienna towers under the late war bombardment. The impregnable had been penetrated. The Allied dilemma was solved not by avoiding the fortress, but by inventing a key that could unlock its destruction from within. The turning point was not a single date, but a demonstrable shift in capability. From that moment on, the Flak Towers stood not as untouchable titans, but as high-value, vulnerable targets awaiting the arrival of the one weapon that could undo them. Their continued existence became a question of statistical chance. How long until the next bombardier's aim was true, rather than one of material science. The final, desperate defense of the Reich would now play out in the shadow of these scarred and smoldering monoliths, their invincibility a memory buried under tons of shattered concrete and steel. The breaching of their roofs did not immediately end the operational life of every Flak Tower, but it fundamentally altered their role from sanctuaries to potential tombs. In Berlin, during the final apocalyptic battle of the city in April and May 1945, the remaining towers became islands of last-ditch Nazi resistance amidst the Soviet flood. The Zoo Tower, despite its scars, became a fortress in the urban wilderness. Its guns, depressed to their minimum elevation, fired directly into the advancing lines of Soviet infantry and tanks. The 128 shells, designed to explode in the air near bombers, now functioned as devastating direct-fire artillery, blowing entire buildings apart. The towers' lower-level machine gun nests turned the surrounding streets into killing zones. But the penetration bombs had done their work psychologically and logistically. The towers were no longer secure rear area bases. They were besieged castles, cut off and surrounded. Supplies of food, water, and ammunition dwindled. The hospitals inside overflowed with casualties from the street fighting. The civilian shelters, once a propaganda showcase, became overcrowded charnel houses where disease spread and hope evaporated. The Soviet Red Army, recognizing the towers as formidable strongpoints, largely bypassed them. Instead of costly frontal assaults, they subjected them to relentless direct artillery fire from heavy howitzers and the fire of tank destroyers at point-blank range. While these attacks could not bring the structures down, they kept the defenders pinned, battered, and isolated. The final capitulation of the Flak Towers was as symbolic as their construction had been. The Zoo Towers garrison, under the command of a Luftwaffe officer, held out for 2 days after Hitler's suicide and the general surrender of Berlin. Their final act was not a glorious last stand, but a negotiated surrender to the Soviet Fifth Shock Army on May 2, 1945. The surviving soldiers and civilians emerged, blinking, into a shattered world, leaving behind the stench of death and cordite sealed in concrete. In Vienna, the towers surrendered piecemeal to advancing Soviet forces. Their military utility had ended not with a dramatic collapse, but with the silent cessation of fire, the raising of white sheets from the gun platforms, and the slow, defeated procession of their occupants into captivity. The weapons that were meant to defend the Reich for 1,000 years had lasted barely 5, their final hours spent in a futile defense of a regime that had already ceased to exist. The immediate human cost encapsulated within their walls was staggering, though exact numbers remain buried in the chaos of the fall. In Berlin's towers, it is estimated that over 30,000 civilians sought refuge during the final battle. Thousands died inside from the direct and indirect effects of bombardment, from disease, or from the subsequent harsh conditions of Soviet internment. The garrisons themselves suffered heavy casualties in the final ground fighting. In Vienna, the penetrator bomb strikes had killed hundreds in single, catastrophic internal explosions. The towers, designed as shelters, had become efficient collective graves, their very strength trapping the occupants with the violence unleashed within. With the war's end, the victorious Allies surveyed a continent in ruins. Amidst the mountains of brick and rubble, the Flak Towers stood almost mockingly intact. Their sheer durability, the very quality that had defined them, now made them monstrous problems for the peacetime administrators of Berlin, Hamburg, and Vienna. Demilitarization was immediate. The guns were dismantled, the radar equipment scavenged, but the structures themselves, those 3.5-meter thick walls and 5-meter thick roofs, defied conventional demolition. They were, in the words of one frustrated engineer, built for eternity with the wrong eternity in mind. The British, in their sector of Berlin, made the first serious attempt to destroy the zoo tower in 1947. They packed 25 tons of explosives into its lower floors, a quantity that would level a city district. The resulting detonation was immense, a thunderclap heard across the ruined city. When the dust settled, the tower had not collapsed. It was damaged, scarred, but it stood. It had absorbed an explosive force greater than any single bomb dropped on it during the war and remained structurally defiant. The cost and danger of further attempts were deemed prohibitive. In Hamburg, a similar fate befell attempts to remove its towers. The lesson was learned across occupied Germany. These were not buildings to be demolished, they were geographical features to be managed. Thus began the long, awkward afterlife of the Flak Towers. Their uses became pragmatic, often incongruous with their brutal origins. In Berlin, the hollowed-out zoo tower was used as a secure storage site for archival film reels, its climate-stable interior finding a peaceful purpose. The Latum at Humboldthain became a climbing wall for a local sports club, its pockmarked concrete offering a unique challenge. In Vienna, the Ehrenberg Park Tower found use as a repository for fine art, protecting masterpieces from the elements as it had once protected gun crews. The Augarten Tower, standing in public park, was leased to a company specializing in secure data storage. Others sat empty, slowly colonized by pigeons and graffiti. The most profound struggle with their legacy, however, was not physical but moral and historical. They were undeniable, looming facts of Nazi megalomania and the war's totality. To simply ignore them was impossible. To glorify them was unthinkable. Different cities adopted different strategies. Hamburg, after decades of debate, partially dismantled one tower and integrated the remains into a new building, deliberately obscuring its original form. In Berlin, the Humboldthain Tower was partially buried under rubble from the city's reconstruction, turning it into an artificial hill topped with a park. Deliberate act of concealment by landscape. Yet their very indestructibility ensures they remain. Today, they serve as the war's most visceral, unshakable monuments, not as celebratory memorials, but as raw, uncomfortable relics. Guided tour now take visitors through the damp, echoing interiors of the Berlin towers, the guide's flashlight beam illuminating rusted ammunition hoists and faded wartime graffiti. The narrative is not of heroism, but of the architecture of total war, of the false promise of absolute security, and of the terrifying cost paid by those both outside and within their walls. They stand as the ultimate testament to the fact that the most formidable defenses are often rendered obsolete, not by brute force alone, but by the relentless evolution of offensive ingenuity, and that even in their enduring physical form, they are prisoners of the history they were built to shape. The final, quiet battle of the Flak Towers is this ongoing one, against being forgotten, against being normalized, forcing each generation to confront the unsettling concrete reality of the past they represent. This long, contested aftermath leads us to a final, sobering consideration of what these colossal structures ultimately signify in the broad sweep of history and human conflict. The Flak Towers endure, not as triumphant citadels, but as silent, brooding questions. Cast in reinforced concrete, they are the ultimate paradox of defensive warfare. embodiments of a security so absolute it became a trap, testaments to a strength so formidable it invited its own specialized annihilation. Their story transcends the tactical narrative of bombers and anti-aircraft guns. It is a parable of escalation, of the relentless dialectic between shield and spear. The Third Reich, confronted with the vulnerability of its cities, responded not with dispersal or deception but with monumental, defiant concentration. It built fortresses that were also symbols, believing that sheer mass could defy the changing calculus of aerial destruction. In doing so, it created a target that demanded a new kind of spear. Weapon of focused penetration that turned the fortress's greatest asset, its impregnable interior, into its fatal flaw. The penetrator bomb did not destroy the Flak Tower idea through overwhelming force. It defeated it through precise, intelligent violence, a surgical strike against the theory of invulnerability itself. Today, these structures force us to contemplate the architecture of power and fear. They were built to protect, yet their presence inevitably drew fire. They offered sanctuary. While functioning as a primary military target, they were designed as testaments to a thousand-year future, yet they served only a crumbling regime's final, desperate months. In this, they are perhaps the most honest ruins of the Second World War. They have no heroic patina. Their lines are brutal, their purpose unambiguous, their legacy deeply conflicted. They stand not as memorials to the fallen, but as monuments to a specific, catastrophic mindset, the belief that any problem, even the democratizing terror of strategic bombing, could be solved by sufficient application of mass, will, and concrete. Their ultimate lesson is one of humility. They remind us that in the face of relentless technological and tactical evolution, there is no final word in defense, no permanent fortress. The search for absolute security can often lead to the construction of one's own magnificent, inescapable tomb. The Flak Towers, therefore, remain, not as relics of strength but as permanent, sobering fixtures on the landscape of history, reminding all who see them that the most imposing walls are never the end of the story. They are merely the beginning of a new challenge.